The Kansas plains stretched wide beneath a sky heavy with dust, the evening sun bleeding into red across the horizon. Inside a weather-worn cabin of rough pine logs, Mary sat with her back against the wall, cradling her youngest daughter against her chest. The child whimpered softly, still too small to understand the sharp crack of Samuel's hand that had echoed moments before. Mary's cheek burned, swelling beneath the rough fabric of the shawl she kept pulled tight across her face. Her other two daughters huddled silently in the corner, eyes wide, learning too young the meaning of fear. Samuel's boots thudded across the warped floorboards. His voice was like a knife drawn too quick from its sheath. "3 girls," he spat. 3 useless mouths. "What kind of wife gives a man no sons? What kind of woman are you?" His words carried more weight than the blow, because they lingered long after silence returned. Mary bowed her head, keeping her lips pressed shut. Any answer would bring more rage, and she had none left to give. She listened instead to the quiet sobs of her daughters, her heart splitting between the ache of shame and the desperate instinct to shield them. She pulled the shawl higher, hiding her face not only from Samuel, but from herself. Out beyond the cabin walls, the wind sang through tall prairie grass, carrying with it the distant rattle of wagon wheels heading west. Mary heard them sometimes, families leaving, chasing something better in Colorado or further still. Each creak of a wheel reminded her there was a world beyond this cage of timber and anger. But to step into it alone, with 3 small girls, seemed a dream too dangerous to touch. The neighbors in the nearest settlement knew, of course. A woman's bruises were no secret in such a small community. Yet when she walked to church with her head bowed and her face veiled, people looked away. The preacher spoke of duty, the women whispered of misfortune, and the men muttered that Samuel's bitterness was his right. No one dared interfere. That silence weighed on Mary as heavily as the blows themselves. But somewhere deep within her, under the layers of fear, shame, and obedience, a small ember smoldered. She longed for a life where her daughters could laugh freely, where their worth was not measured by the shape of their bodies or the possibility of sons. That ember flickered whenever she saw the sun sink golden on the horizon, whenever she heard the lowing of cattle drifting over the plains, whenever she remembered the sound of her mother's gentle voice long ago, telling her that a woman's spirit was stronger than any man's cruelty. Still, the walls of the cabin held her fast. Each day was survival, baking coarse bread, hauling water from the creek, mending clothes until her fingers bled. Samuel returned from long days in the fields, angrier each season, worn by drought and debts, and Mary bore the brunt of that storm. She whispered no complaint, only pressed her daughters close when he slept heavy with whiskey. One night, as the fire in the hearth burned low and the girls lay curled together under patched quilts, Mary stared at the flames until her eyes blurred. She imagined the world beyond the plains, the jagged peaks of the Rockies she had heard about, rivers running clear, valleys untouched by Samuel's bitterness, a place where her daughters might run barefoot without fear of his shadow. The thought both terrified and sustained her, though she dared not voice it even to herself. And yet this story is not only about silence and shadows, it is about the moment when silence breaks, when a woman beaten for birthing girls dares to dream of something more, and the stranger who would one day lift her from despair into the promise of freedom. Before we continue deeper into Mary's painful journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one, stories of struggle, resilience, and the human spirit's fight for dignity. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters as though carrying a message she could not yet hear. Mary drew her shawl tighter, unaware that fate had already begun its slow turn, and that the echo of wagon wheels on the trail would soon draw closer than she ever imagined. The days on the Kansas plains were long, their hours stretched thin beneath an unforgiving sky. The land, flat and endless, seemed to mirror Mary's own exhaustion. Each morning, before the sun had lifted its full weight over the horizon, she rose to haul water from the creek, her shawl pulled close against the chill. Her daughters, still half asleep, followed with small buckets, their bare feet numb in the frosted grass. The prairie wind cut sharp, carrying with it the dry scent of dust that had begun to settle over the fields. The drought had come early that year, robbing the soil of its strength. Samuel cursed the heavens, his voice rising as though shouting at God himself might coax rain from the stubborn sky. "A man works his hands raw, and for what?" he bellowed one evening, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. "This land gives nothing." "And you—" His eyes flicked toward Mary, sharp as the blade he kept on his belt. "You give me nothing either." Mary lowered her gaze, hiding behind the folds of her shawl. She said nothing, though her stomach twisted with hunger. The bread on the table was little more than coarse flour and water, stretched thin to feed 4 mouths. Samuel ate his fill first, and Mary ensured her daughters had what little remained before she touched a crumb herself. Life in the settlement offered no respite. At the trading post, whispers followed her, though none were spoken loud enough for Samuel to hear. A neighbor woman once asked gently, "Mary, are you well?" But when Samuel's shadow filled the doorway, the question withered on her lips. Men greeted Samuel with forced respect, their eyes darting away from Mary's hidden face. Everyone knew, no one spoke. Silence was its own prison. The girls clung to her skirts, sensing what they could not name. Little Anna, only 5, once tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Mama, why doesn't Papa smile at us?" Mary pressed her daughter's hair against her chest and forced a steady tone. "He carries heavy burdens, my sweet. It is not your fault." But inside her heart broke at the thought that her daughters might grow up believing love was always sharp, always cruel. The weather itself seemed a reflection of Samuel's temper, hot winds that cracked the earth, storms that tore through without warning, leaving wreckage behind. Nights were worst, when the walls of the cabin seemed to close in, and Samuel's frustration boiled over in harsh words and heavy fists. Mary learned to move silently, to soothe her children quickly, to fold herself smaller and smaller until she was little more than a shadow in her own home. And yet she endured. For the sake of her daughters, she carried water, baked bread, patched clothes until her fingers bled. She endured the ache in her bones, the hollow in her stomach, the bruises that bloomed and faded, only to return again. Each hardship hardened her in quiet ways, though she did not yet recognize the strength forming inside her. At church on Sundays, Samuel sat tall, his arm draped across the pew as though claiming his territory. The preacher's words about obedience and duty seemed meant for Mary alone, and Samuel would nod approvingly. Mary kept her shawl drawn low, the hymn book trembling in her hands. When the congregation sang of salvation, she wondered if heaven held a place for women like her, who prayed not for riches or long life, but for a single night of peace. Still, life carried on, because life on the frontier always did. The cattle bawled in the distance, the prairie stretched unbroken, and the horizon seemed endless. Yet within that endlessness, Mary felt the stirrings of something she could not yet name. Survival was not the same as living, and some part of her knew that the plains, harsh as they were, might one day carry her toward more than endurance. The drought deepened, Samuel's temper grew, and Mary tightened her shawl, hiding her face from the world. But inside, a question flickered, faint and insistent. How long could a woman survive in silence before silence itself became too heavy to bear? Mary often found her thoughts wandering as she bent over the washboard at the creek, her hands raw from scrubbing clothes against stone. The water flowed slow and shallow, clouded with silt, yet it offered her a small refuge from the cabin's walls. Her daughters played nearby, weaving flowers into one another's hair, their laughter carrying faintly across the breeze. For a moment, Mary let herself imagine that laughter untouched by fear. The prairie stretched before her, vast and unbroken. Each day, wagon ruts grew deeper on the trail beyond the creek. She watched those tracks whenever she could, imagining where they might lead. A trader once told her of Colorado's towering peaks, where rivers ran cold and pure. Another spoke of Montana, where valleys spread wide with promise, untouched by the suffocating weight of expectation. She tucked those fragments into her memory, like scraps of cloth hidden in a basket, too precious to throw away. At night, when Samuel's snores shook the rafters and the girls lay curled in their quilts, Mary whispered silent words to the ceiling. They were not prayers, not in the way the preacher demanded. They were questions. Could I walk away? Could I cross the plains with 3 little girls and no husband to shield us? Would the world swallow us whole? The silence gave no answer, yet her heart trembled each time she asked. Fear was a chain heavier than any iron. She knew what became of women who struck out alone. Stories drifted through the settlement of widows taken by fever, of families lost to bandits, of wagons overturned in swollen rivers. The prairie was beautiful, but it showed no mercy. To risk the lives of her daughters felt unthinkable, and yet to remain promised only more of Samuel's wrath, more of the hollow ache of survival. Once, after a particularly harsh evening when Samuel's words had cut deeper than his hand, Mary sat beside the fire with her eldest, Ruth, who was barely 9. Ruth brushed Mary's hair with a small wooden comb, her touch gentle, careful not to tug. "Mama," Ruth said softly, "when I grow up, will I be like you?" Mary froze, her throat tightening. She turned, pulling Ruth close, and whispered, "No, sweetheart. You will be free to be whoever you wish." But even as she said it, she felt the sting of doubt. What future could she truly offer her daughters here? The wagon trails called to her louder each passing week. She listened when neighbors spoke of men selling mules, of families gathering supplies for long journeys westward. Every detail carved itself into her memory. She knew how many sacks of flour a wagon could carry, how many barrels of water might last, which herbs the women used when children fell ill. She gathered knowledge like a secret weapon, though she dared not speak of it aloud. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between chores, she would stand at the doorway, shawl pulled tight, and let her gaze linger on the horizon. The endless line where earth met sky seemed to whisper of something beyond her reach, something waiting. She could almost see herself walking into that distance, her daughter's hands in hers, the cabin shrinking smaller and smaller until it vanished altogether. But then the slam of Samuel's boots across the floor would drag her back, reminding her of the weight that bound her. "Quit your dreaming," he barked once, catching her staring westward. "A woman's place is here. You'd last a day out there." His words burned, because part of her feared he was right, and yet another part, faint but steady, whispered that perhaps he was wrong. That whisper became her companion, a fragile thread of hope woven through her days of labor and silence. She held on to it quietly, not daring to let it show, but feeling it grow all the same. The frontier was merciless, yes, but so was the life she already endured. And in the balance between fear and longing, Mary began to realize that the question was no longer whether she could leave, but whether she could survive if she stayed. The settlement's trading post sat at the edge of the wagon trail, its rough-hewn timbers standing like weary sentinels against the prairie wind. Mary went there once a week with her daughters, carrying a basket of eggs to barter for flour or salt. She always kept her shawl drawn tight, her face hidden from prying eyes. But that morning, as the wind whipped dust across the yard, she noticed a figure different from the usual neighbors and farmers. A tall man stood by a wagon laden with furs, his shoulders broad beneath a buckskin coat, his hair streaked with gray, though his face was still strong. His presence seemed to belong more to the mountains than the plains, as though he carried the scent of pine forests and snow-melt rivers with him. His name, she overheard, was Elias Boone, a mountain man. The storekeeper greeted him with cautious respect. Men like Elias lived by their own codes, hunting and trapping deep in the wilderness, far from towns and farms. They came to trade pelts for supplies, then vanished again into the vast unknown. Most folks regarded them with a mix of awe and suspicion, for they belonged to no law but their own. Mary tried not to stare, but when she handed over her basket of eggs, she caught Elias's gaze from across the room. His eyes were steady, a clear gray that seemed to see more than she wanted revealed. She pulled her shawl lower, heart quickening, though he said nothing. He simply nodded once, polite but reserved, before returning to his trade. Her daughters, curious, whispered among themselves as they watched him heft bundles of pelts. Little Anna tugged at Mary's sleeve. "Mama, he looks like a giant." Mary hushed her gently, urging the girls to stay close. Outside, the prairie wind tugged at her skirt as she loaded her parcel of flour. She felt Elias's presence still, though he had not spoken a word to her. There was something unsettling about being noticed, even briefly. She was used to being overlooked, a shadow beside Samuel's imposing frame. To have a stranger see her, even through a veil of cloth, made her uneasy. That evening Samuel returned late, sour with drink, muttering about the trapper who thinks he's better than decent folk. Mary said nothing, but her ears sharpened. Samuel's pride bristled easily, and any man who drew attention, even unintentionally, became a thorn in his side. Over the next weeks, Mary saw Elias twice more at the post. Each time, he carried himself with the same quiet strength, speaking little, trading only what he needed. He never addressed her directly, never pried, but she caught his gaze more than once. It was not the look of judgment she often felt from neighbors, nor the dismissive glance of men who considered her invisible. It was steady, as if he saw her not as a burden or a blemish, but simply as a person. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like Elias came and went, their paths crossing briefly with those tied to the land. Still, the memory of his grey eyes lingered as she worked the washboard, as she knelt to tend the fire, as she pressed her daughters to sleep. There was no reason for it, yet she felt it all the same. A stirring, faint and dangerous, like the first hint of thunder far off on the horizon. The prairie taught her that storms began this way, quiet at first, then rising with a force no one could stop. She drew her shawl tighter, willing herself to forget, yet some part of her already knew that the stranger's presence, however brief, had unsettled the silence of her world. And though she did not yet understand it, his path and hers were already set on a course that could not be turned aside. The summer heat pressed heavy over the plains, the soil cracking beneath a sky that refused to give rain. Mary worked harder than ever, her skirts damp with sweat as she carried water to the small patch of vegetables clinging to life near the cabin. The girls helped, their small hands clutching tin cups, but the earth swallowed every drop without thanks. Samuel's temper worsened with each failed attempt to coax green from brown. One evening, as the youngest daughter coughed weakly in her bed, Samuel's voice thundered through the cabin. "She's sick because you're too soft on them. You coddle and spoil, and look what it brings. Weakness." He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the plates. The child whimpered, and Mary gathered her close, whispering comfort that Samuel refused to give. "You blame me for everything," Mary said quietly, her voice trembling but steady enough to make Samuel snap his head toward her. "Don't you dare talk back." His eyes burned, a storm behind them. "If you'd given me a son, none of this would matter. A boy could work the fields, could carry weight. But no, I'm cursed with daughters who cry at the sight of dust." Mary lowered her eyes, though inside she fought the swell of anger rising with her fear. His words carved at her heart, but they also revealed his weakness. Samuel's pride was the only crop he tended well, and it grew poisonous. The next day she went to the trading post with Ruth, her eldest, who carried a basket of beans. The store was busy, settlers gathering supplies as rumors of better grazing land further west spread quickly. Among the crowd stood Elias Boone. He leaned against the counter, speaking in his slow, even tone as he bartered pelts for tools. When Mary entered, Ruth clutching her hand, Samuel was already there, his face dark with drink. He glared at Elias, muttering loud enough for nearby men to hear. "Mountain trash, thinking he can swagger in like he owns the place." Elias didn't flinch. He met Samuel's gaze calmly, his voice quiet but firm. "I came to trade, nothing more." Mary stood frozen near the doorway, her shawl tight against her face. The air inside the store thickened, neighbors turning their eyes toward the brewing conflict. Samuel puffed his chest, ready to spit more venom, but Elias turned away, refusing to ignite the fire Samuel sought. That quiet refusal stung worse than insult. Outside, as Mary loaded her parcel, she heard Samuel's voice behind her, sharp with warning. "Stay away from men like him. He's nothing but a drifter. Don't think for a second he'd look twice at the likes of you." Mary said nothing. But she noticed Ruth's curious glance toward Elias, who had stepped outside just then, tipping his hat politely. For the briefest moment, his eyes met Mary's again, not long enough to draw Samuel's wrath, but long enough to stir something unsettled in her chest. That night, Samuel drank himself into a rage, replaying the moment at the post as though it were a wound to his pride. He accused Mary of seeking Elias's attention, his words cutting deeper than his fists ever could. She bit her tongue, clinging to silence, knowing that any defense would fuel his fury further. Yet, as she lay awake long after Samuel's snores filled the cabin, she remembered Elias's steady gaze, his refusal to fight anger with anger. It was not admiration she felt, nor the dangerous stirrings of affection. It was recognition, an understanding that strength could look different than Samuel's violence. It could be quiet, resolute, and unyielding. The prairie night whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. Mary closed her eyes, her heart heavy with fear, yet touched by something new, the realization that Samuel's power over her was not unshakable, and though she dared not admit it aloud, she began to sense that change was coming, as sure as the storms that gathered on the horizon. The harvest season came thin and bitter. The corn barely rose past Samuel's knees, the stalks yellowing before their time. Each day he cursed the land, cursed the sky, cursed Mary for what he called her failings. His anger spilled over with little warning now, sharp and brutal, as though each disappointment in the fields demanded blood in the cabin. One Sunday after service, Mary walked with her daughters along the dusty path toward the wagon. The sun bore down, the air heavy with silence, as neighbors gave her wide berth. Samuel lagged behind, speaking with men near the church steps. When he finally approached, his face was set in stone. Without a word, he struck her across the cheek, hard enough that the shawl slipped from her head and fell into the dirt. Gasps rippled through those gathered. The purple and yellow bruises across her face lay bare for all to see. Mary felt every eye upon her, but none moved forward. Some lowered their gazes, pretending not to notice. Others shifted uncomfortably, murmuring behind calloused hands. Children stared until their mothers pulled them away. Shame burned hotter than the sting of the blow. Her eldest, Ruth, darted to pick up the shawl, pressing it back into her mother's trembling hands. "Mama," she whispered, voice shaking. Mary wrapped it around herself again, hiding the truth as she always did. Samuel's voice cut through the murmurs. "A man has a right to discipline his wife. Don't look at me as though I've done wrong." His glare swept the crowd, daring anyone to contradict him. No one spoke. The preacher coughed into his hand, eyes fixed on the ground. From the edge of the gathering, a pair of grey eyes watched. Elias Boone stood near his wagon, his jaw tight, his shoulders stiff. He said nothing, but Mary saw the fire in his gaze before he turned away. For a moment she felt both relief and disappointment. Relief that he had not stepped forward and risked Samuel's wrath. Disappointment that no one, not even a man as strong as Elias, would speak against the cruelty that had become her life. On the walk home, Samuel muttered under his breath, pride swelling in the silence of the townsfolk. "They know better than to interfere. A man rules his own household. That's the way of things." His voice carried satisfaction, as though the public shame he inflicted only cemented his power further. Mary clutched Ruth's hand tighter, her mind a storm. The sting of the slap was nothing compared to the hollow ache that followed. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that someone, anyone, might rise against the injustice. But the silence of the crowd weighed heavier than Samuel's blow. It told her plainly, no one would save her. That night, after Samuel collapsed drunk in his chair, Mary sat by the hearth, the shawl pooled at her shoulders. The firelight danced over her bruises, casting shadows across the walls. Her daughters lay sleeping, their breaths uneven from dreams they did not speak. Mary stared into the flames, her thoughts sharper than they had ever been. She realized then that silence could no longer shield her. Covering her face did not erase the truth. Hiding did not protect her daughters from the storm that raged within Samuel. And though fear knotted her stomach, another truth rose alongside it. If she waited for others to act, she would wait until the end of her days. The prairie wind howled against the shutters, a mournful cry that seemed to echo her own heart. Mary closed her eyes, gripping the shawl as though it were both a shroud and a shield. The breaking point had come. She could not yet see the path forward, but she knew the life she lived could not continue. Something, whether born of her own will or the hand of fate, would soon have to change. The night carried no stars, only a pale sliver of moon hanging low over the plains. Inside the cabin, the air reeked of whiskey and rage. Samuel had stumbled in hours earlier, muttering curses about debts and neighbors who whispered like hens. When Mary spoke softly to hush the children, his anger flared, his hand striking her so hard she tasted blood. The girls cowered in silence, their small bodies pressed into the shadows. Mary gathered them once Samuel collapsed into a drunken sleep, his snores filling the room like thunder. Her cheek throbbed, her heart pounding louder than the wind outside. She knew then what she had refused to admit all these years. If she stayed, Samuel would not stop until she was broken beyond repair. Mary pressed her lips to each of her daughters' foreheads. "Stay close to me," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. She wrapped the youngest in her shawl, lifted her into her arms, and guided the other two to the door. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a shout, every breath like a warning. She froze when Samuel stirred, his hand twitching against the table. But his snores deepened again, and she pulled the door open. The night air was sharp, the prairie stretching dark and endless before her. Her daughters clung to her skirts as they hurried across the yard, their bare feet silent in the dust. Behind them, the cabin loomed, a prison she prayed never to see again. She did not know where the trail might take her. She only knew she had to reach it before dawn. Hours later, exhaustion dragged at her limbs. The girls stumbled, crying quietly from hunger and fear. Mary's arms ached from carrying the youngest, but she dared not stop. At last, near the wagon ruts carved deep into the soil, her strength faltered. She sank to her knees, pulling the children close, whispering promises she could not yet believe herself. "We'll find a way, just a little further. I won't let him hurt you again." The prairie wind answered with a low howl. Mary bowed her head, tears hot against her bruised skin. She had nothing, no food, no horse, no plan. Only desperation carried her this far. Dawn crept slowly across the land, the horizon bleeding pale gold. That was when the sound reached her, the steady creak of wagon wheels, the snort of a mule. She looked up, her heart leaping and twisting with both hope and dread. A wagon approached, the silhouette of a man guiding it. It was Elias Boone. He slowed as he spotted her, his sharp eyes taking in the sight of a woman crouched in the dirt with 3 children clinging to her. He said nothing at first. The silence stretched, filled only by the groan of the wheels and the cry of a meadowlark. Then Elias stepped down from the wagon, his boots crunching softly against the soil. Mary tried to rise, shame flooding her, but her legs gave out. She pulled the shawl tighter around her face, as though it might shield her from recognition. "Please," she whispered, barely audible, "we only need a little rest." Elias crouched before her, his voice calm, steady, without judgment. "You're safe now. Let me help." He lifted her gently as though she weighed no more than a bundle of cloth. The children clung to him without hesitation, their small hands grasping at his coat. For the first time in years, Mary felt herself carried not by duty or fear, but by the strength of another who asked nothing in return. As Elias settled them into the wagon, Mary closed her eyes, the tears slipping free. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. But in that moment, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that escape was possible. Mary awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a creek rushing nearby. For a moment, confusion held her. She expected the harsh scent of whiskey, Samuel's heavy breathing, the oppressive weight of the cabin. Instead, she lay beneath a rough wool blanket, her daughters curled close, their cheeks flushed from warmth rather than fear. Elias Boone moved quietly about the camp, feeding the fire and checking the mule's harness. His movements were efficient, deliberate, yet there was no harshness in him. He glanced toward her once, offering a nod but asking no questions. Mary adjusted the shawl around her face, her instinct still to hide. Her eldest daughter stirred first. "Mama, we're safe," Ruth asked softly. Mary brushed a hand through her hair. "For now, sweetheart." Her voice trembled, though she tried to steady it. Elias set a tin cup of water near her without a word. The simple act carried more kindness than she had felt in years. She whispered thanks, her throat raw, but he only nodded, as if such courtesy required no acknowledgement. As the day stretched on, Elias guided the wagon northward, away from the settlement and deeper into the prairie. The land opened wide, grasses rippling like waves beneath the wind. For the children, it was adventure. They pointed out hawks circling overhead, rabbits darting into burrows, wildflowers bending beneath the wheels. Their laughter rang against the sky, strange and bright after so many years of silence. Mary, however, felt her stomach twist with unease. Each mile carried her further from the life she had known, but also deeper into the unknown. Fear gnawed at her. Where would this road lead? Could she trust a man she barely knew? Would Samuel come after them? She clutched the shawl tighter, her mind a tangle of doubt and guilt. At midday, Elias halted by a grove of cottonwoods near a stream. He showed the girls how to skip stones, his deep voice steady, patient. Little Anna squealed with delight when her pebble bounced twice before sinking. Ruth watched closely, determined, her brow furrowed in concentration. Mary sat apart, torn between gratitude and suspicion. Elias eventually approached, crouching near the fire he had built for cooking. "They're strong girls," he said simply, his tone neither pitying nor patronizing. Mary tightened the shawl. "Stronger than I deserve." Elias studied her, though not unkindly. Strength isn't something a man gives or takes. It grows where it must. His words lingered long after the fire burned low. Mary had spent years believing her weakness chained her daughters to misery. Hearing otherwise unsettled her, yet warmed something deep inside. That night, under a sky full of stars, Elias offered them space within the wagon while he slept outside by the fire. Mary watched him from the shadows, noting how he rested with his rifle close, not out of menace but habit. He was a man accustomed to danger, prepared to meet it without flinching. Ruth whispered in the darkness, "Mama, will he take us to the mountains?" Mary hushed her, stroking her hair. "I don't know yet." But her heart beat faster at the thought. The mountains. She had heard of them in stories, towering and free, untouched by Samuel's hand. Could such a place exist for them? As the fire crackled outside, Mary lay awake, her daughters breathing steadily beside her. Fear remained, heavy as ever, but for the first time it was not alone. Alongside it stirred something unfamiliar, a fragile thread of hope woven through the night like the silver light of the moon. Back in the settlement, the empty cabin did not go unnoticed. By mid-morning, Samuel stormed into the yard shouting Mary's name, his face red with fury and disbelief. The girls' quilts lay abandoned on their bed, her shawl missing, the silence inside screaming louder than words. He kicked over the table, his rage spilling into curses that carried out across the yard. "She thinks she can run?" he muttered, fists trembling as he pulled on his boots. "She belongs to me. She'll see what comes of shame like hers." By the time the sun reached its height, Samuel was in town demanding help. At the trading post, his voice roared, "She's stolen from me, took food, took blankets, took my own children. A man can't let that stand." He spun his tale with the venom of betrayal, calling her flight an act of theft, not survival. Some nodded, wary of Samuel's temper but unwilling to challenge his claim. Others exchanged quiet glances, knowing well what had driven her away. A rancher's wife whispered to her neighbor, maybe she had reason to go. But the words barely left her lips before her husband silenced her with a glare. Few dared to speak what most already knew. Mary had suffered for years beneath Samuel's hand. Still on the frontier, law bent toward the man, and Samuel wore his authority like armor. By evening he had gathered 2 men to ride with him, neighbors who owed him favors, or perhaps feared his wrath more than their conscience. With rifles slung across their saddles, they set off, determined to follow the wagon ruts etched deep into the earth. Mary, meanwhile, felt the prickle of unease as Elias guided the wagon farther from familiar ground. The prairie stretched wide, the horizon endless, yet she could not shake the sense of being watched. Her daughters played with sticks near the wagon bed, laughter spilling freely, but Mary's heart remained heavy. She glanced toward Elias, her voice low. "He'll come after us." Elias didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Most men like him do." Fear tightened her throat. "Then what will we do?" His answer came calm, steady. "We keep moving, and if he finds us, we'll decide then." Mary wanted certainty, a promise of safety, but Elias gave none. Instead, his honesty unsettled her in a different way, because it rang true. He was not a man to make empty assurances. He was a man who met hardship as it came. That night, the firelight flickered across his weathered face as he skinned a rabbit for their supper. The children slept close, their bellies full for the first time in days. Mary sat with her arms around her knees, listening to the crackle of wood. She broke the silence at last. "If he catches us, he'll call me a thief." Elias paused, his knife glinting. "Doesn't matter what he calls you. You chose to leave. That's what matters." His words settled into her like stone dropped into water, rippling out through years of silence. She stared into the flames, realizing that for the first time someone had named her choice as her own, not as sin, not as weakness, but as action. Still, the unease grew. In her mind, Samuel's voice rang louder than the wind. "You belong to me, you'll see what comes." She pulled the shawl tighter, though it did nothing to shield her from the memory of his wrath. Far behind them, under the same moon, Samuel and his men rode hard, the trail clear before them. Each hoofbeat echoed a promise of reckoning. The prairie stretched endless beneath a sky streaked with red at dawn. Elias drove the wagon steadily, his posture upright, his eyes never still. Mary sat in silence, her daughters huddled beside her, their small bodies swaying with each bump of the wheels. Though she tried to quiet her mind, unease clung to her like burrs in cloth. She knew Samuel was behind them, whether days or hours she could not say. At midday, Elias halted near a grove of cottonwoods. The girls rushed to the stream, splashing in the shallows, laughter breaking through the tension. Mary remained close, her shawl tight, her gaze drifting back toward the trail they had left. Elias crouched to refill the canteens, then glanced at her. "You're listening for him," he said, not as a question but a statement. Mary swallowed hard. "He won't stop. He'll tell the world I stole from him, that I—" Her voice faltered. Elias's expression didn't change, but his voice carried weight. "A man can claim many things, doesn't make them true." Mary turned toward him, searching his face. "But people believe men like Samuel, always have. They'll say I abandoned my duty, that I don't deserve to raise my girls." Elias tightened the canteen cap, his hands steady. "Out here, truth isn't decided by gossip. It's decided by who has the strength to stand by it." His words struck something deep, yet Mary felt fear coil tighter inside. "Strength? I've lived my whole life in silence because I had none." Elias looked at her then, his grey eyes cutting through her shame. "No. You had strength enough to walk away. Don't mistake quiet for weakness. A woman who leaves everything she's known to protect her children, that's strength most men wouldn't understand." Mary's throat tightened. For years, Samuel had called her fragile, broken, worthless. Now, for the first time, another voice dared to name her choice differently. She wanted to believe it, yet the weight of fear pressed heavy still. As the day wore on, the girls returned, tired from play. Elias taught Ruth how to tie a better knot with the rope, his large hands guiding her small fingers. "You'll need to know this," he told her, his tone practical, not patronizing. Mary watched in silence, realizing how naturally her daughter leaned into his instruction, how different it was from the sharp commands Samuel barked. Later, when the fire crackled and shadows stretched long, Mary sat apart, her arms around her knees. Elias sharpened his knife by the flames, the steady scrape of stone against steel filling the night. At last she asked, her voice low, "Why are you helping us? You don't even know me." Elias paused, setting the blade aside. His gaze held hers across the firelight. "I don't need to know you to see a wrong. A man's code out here is simple. Protect the innocent. Stand against cruelty. Your husband forgot what it means to be a man." "That's on him, not you." Mary felt her chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something closer to relief, though she dared not name it. His words carried no pity, no false sweetness. They were plain, as solid as the earth beneath her feet. She pulled her shawl tighter, though it no longer felt like armor. If Samuel finds us, will you stand with me?" Elias's voice was quiet but firm. "I won't let him take you back." The fire popped, sending sparks into the dark. Mary stared into the flames, her heart torn between dread and a fragile spark of trust. For the first time, she sensed that perhaps she was not as alone as Samuel had always made her believe. The river crossing came at dusk, its waters swollen from recent rains. Elias guided the wagon carefully, the mule straining against the current. Mary clutched her daughters close, whispering steady words while the wheels groaned in protest. At last, the wagon climbed onto the opposite bank, dripping and mud-slick. Relief washed through her, but it lasted only a breath. Hoofbeats thundered behind them. From the far side of the river, shapes emerged in the fading light. Samuel and 2 men on horseback. Their rifles glinted faintly as the sun dipped low. Mary's stomach twisted, her heart slamming against her ribs. Samuel's voice carried across the water, loud and venomous. "Mary, you think you can run from me? You think some trapper can hide you from your husband?" His laughter was bitter, cutting. "You're mine, and those girls are mine. You'll come back now or I'll take you by force." Mary trembled, but Elias stepped forward, his stance firm. He placed himself between her and the river, rifle resting loosely in his hands. His voice was calm, steady. "She's not going back with you." The men beside Samuel shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Samuel snarled, urging his horse closer to the water's edge. "You got no right to interfere. That woman is my property, same as my land, same as my cattle. Don't pretend otherwise." Elias's gaze never wavered. "A woman ain't property. She made her choice, and I'll see it stands." For a long moment, the only sound was the rush of the river between them. Mary clutched her daughters tighter, her breath shallow, her body torn between terror and a strange, rising hope. She had heard men speak of rights her whole life, but never had she heard one speak of hers. Samuel spat into the water. "You don't know what you're crossing into, Boone. She's nothing but trouble. She'll drag you down same as she's dragged me. Last chance, send her across or I'll come and take her." Elias raised his rifle slightly, not aiming but making his point clear. His voice was low, final. "You'll do no such thing." One of Samuel's men muttered, "Sam, maybe we let this lie. Ain't worth it." But Samuel's pride flared hotter than reason, his face twisted with rage. "Cowards!" he snapped, glaring at them. "If you won't stand with me, you'll stay behind." He spurred his horse, but the animal balked at the river's pull, refusing to step into the swift current. Samuel cursed, yanking at the reins, his fury spilling into shouts. The other 2 men sat rigid, unwilling to follow. From the opposite bank, Elias stood like stone, unwavering. His presence was enough. Samuel might rage, but the river and Elias's calm defiance formed a barrier he could not cross. At last, Samuel reined back, his face dark with humiliation. "This isn't over," he growled, pointing a finger across the water. "You'll regret the day you laid hands on what's mine." With that, he wheeled his horse, retreating into the gloom. The other men followed, silent and uneasy. Mary sank against the wagon, her knees weak, her breath shaking. She had expected blows, punishment, the crushing weight of being dragged back. Instead, she had seen Samuel turned away, not by violence, but by a man who refused to bend. Elias returned to the fire they built that night, his expression unchanged, as though the confrontation had been nothing more than another chore. But for Mary, something had shifted forever. She stared into the flames, her heart trembling not with fear, but with the dawning realization that Samuel's power was not absolute. For the first time, she felt what resistance looked like, and what it might mean for her own future. The days that followed carried a strange new rhythm. Each sunrise found Mary waking not to Samuel's barked orders, but to the rustle of prairie grass and the soft murmur of Elias tending the fire. The wagon rolled farther west, wheels creaking over ridges and gullies, until the settlement felt like a ghost that could no longer reach her. Fear still lingered, but alongside it grew something unfamiliar, space to breathe. Elias spoke little, Yet he began teaching the girls small skills each day. Ruth learned how to gather kindling that burned hot and steady. Anna practiced braiding rope strong enough to hold a mule. Even the youngest tried her hands at simple tasks, giggling when Elias showed her how to whistle through a blade of grass. Their laughter was no longer a fragile spark, but a steady flame, warming the camp in ways Mary had almost forgotten possible. One morning, Elias pressed a bundle of reins into Mary's hands. Your turn." She stared at the mule uncertainly. "I've never driven a wagon." "You'll learn," he said, climbing down. His tone was not harsh, only matter of fact. The leather felt foreign in her grip, her palms slick with sweat. The mule snorted, shifting its weight, and for a moment she feared it would bolt. "I can't—" "You can," Elias interrupted, his gaze steady. "Talk to him." "Gentle but firm." Mary swallowed, then tried. "Hup," she called softly, tugging the reins just as she had seen him do. To her shock, the mule obeyed, pulling forward with a steady gait. Her daughters cheered, clapping their hands, and a small laugh escaped her throat before she could stop it. Elias walked alongside, offering no praise, no condescension. Only a quiet nod, as if to say he had known all along. That night, as she lay beneath the stars, Mary realized she had felt something she hadn't in years: capable. The lessons continued. Elias showed her how to set snares near the creek, how to read tracks in the dirt, how to tell when weather was shifting by the color of the sky. She listened intently, determined to remember every detail. When her snares caught 2 rabbits, pride swelled in her chest. Her daughters devoured the stew that evening, Anna declaring, "Mama's the best hunter." Mary laughed, shaking her head, but her heart glowed at the words. Still, doubts crept in during the quiet moments. One evening, as the fire crackled low, she whispered to Elias, "What if he finds us again? What if all this—" She gestured at the stars, the girls, the fragile piece, "is only borrowed time?" Elias considered her, his voice even. "You can't live every day waiting for his shadow. Out here, survival belongs to those who keep moving forward. You're doing that. That's more than most." Mary hugged her knees, his words settling deep. She had always thought survival meant endurance, bowing her head and bearing what came. But Elias spoke of survival as movement, choice, defiance. She began to see that the two were not the same. Her daughters mirrored that change. Ruth grew bolder, asking to ride the mule on her own. Anna gathered wildflowers, weaving them into crowns instead of hiding behind her mother's skirts. Even the youngest, once timid, now toddled with confidence, splashing in streams and squealing at frogs. Their laughter rang like bells across the prairie, chasing away echoes of Samuel's voice. Mary still carried fear, but it no longer ruled her every breath. Each new skill, each mile farther from the settlement, wove threads of strength into her heart. She was still scarred, still uncertain, but she was no longer powerless, and though she dared not say it aloud, she felt something stirring inside, the first fragile roots of freedom taking hold. The mountains rose in the distance, their jagged peaks etched against a sky streaked with fire at sunset. Elias guided the wagon toward a narrow pass, the air cooler now, scented with pine and stone. Mary felt both awe and unease. The wilderness was vast, beautiful, but also treacherous. Each turn of the wheels carried them closer to safety, yet she could not shake the dread pressing at her chest. Her fears proved true when hoofbeats broke the quiet. From the shadows of the pass, Samuel emerged with 2 men at his side, rifles slung across their shoulders. His face was hard, lips curled in a cruel smile. "Thought you could outrun me, Mary? You forget who you belong to." Mary froze, her daughters clinging to her skirts, eyes wide. Elias stepped forward, steady as stone, his rifle in hand but lowered. His voice was calm, sharp enough to cut the silence. "Turn back, Samuel, it ends here." Samuel laughed, a sound full of venom. "You think you stand between me and what's mine? She's my wife, those girls are mine, you've no right." Mary's hands shook, but something inside her shifted. For years she had bowed her head, swallowed her voice, hidden behind her shawl. Not now, not with her daughters watching. She stepped forward, her voice trembling at first, then firming with each word. "I am not yours, Samuel. I was never yours to own. You broke me, shamed me, called me worthless, but I will not return to you." Samuel's face twisted, shock flashing before rage overtook him. "You dare speak to me that way, after all I gave you?" "You gave me nothing but pain," she said, her voice rising, "and still I endured. I stayed silent because I believed I had no choice, but I do. My choice is here with my daughters, away from your cruelty." The men beside Samuel shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking from Mary's defiance to Elias's steady stance. One muttered, "Sam, maybe it ain't worth this," but Samuel barked back, "Shut your mouth!" He urged his horse forward, but Elias raised his rifle, his tone iron. "One more step and it's the last you'll take." The tension crackled in the air, sharp as lightning. Mary's heart pounded, yet she did not retreat. She stood beside Elias, her daughters clutched behind her. For the first time, she did not feel like a shadow. She felt like a wall. Samuel's fury burned, but something faltered in his eyes as he looked at her, at the woman who no longer bowed, no longer hid. Her defiance stripped him of power more than Elias's rifle ever could. His grip on the reins tightened, his pride warring with his fear of humiliation. At last he spat into the dirt, his voice low and bitter. "You'll regret this, Mary. Mark my words." Then he wheeled his horse, retreating into the dusk, his men following in silence. The sound of their hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the mountains. Mary stood frozen, breath ragged, her body trembling with the release of years' worth of fear. Elias lowered his rifle slowly, his gaze softening as it fell on her. "You did that," he said simply. Tears blurred her vision, though her voice held steady. "For the first time I spoke the truth." The mountains loomed higher, the night closing in, but Mary no longer felt like a woman trapped by shadows. She had faced Samuel and stood unbroken, and in that moment she knew the course of her life had changed forever. The morning after the pass felt different, as if the air itself had been altered. Mary woke before the sun, the sky a pale promise above the jagged teeth of the mountains. For the first time in a long while, she rose without the weight of dread pooling in her stomach. Her shawl lay folded beside her. The bruise beneath was faint, its colors dimmed by sleep and time. What mattered was the small steady light inside her chest that would not be snuffed by Samuel's memories. She moved quietly so the girls would keep sleeping a moment longer. Ruth stirred, then curled back, small fingers drawing the blanket up under her chin. Anna breathed soft and even, the youngest's lashes shutters over dreams free of trembling. Mary watched them, feeling a bright, fragile gratitude that caught like sunlight on cold water. She thought of how many mornings she had woken with a throat tight as cord, how many dawns had begun with the taste of fear. Not today. Today the air smelled of pine and something like possibility. Elias was already breaking camp, his hands deft and unhurried. He met her gaze and nodded, no words wasted between them. The silence between them flowed with something like understanding. Neither of them needed to speak the small truths that had hardened into them, that she had chosen to leave and that he had chosen to help. That was enough for now. They rode a little farther that day, the trail climbing into thin, clean air. Mary found herself taking the reins more often, her fingers confident, her hands no longer trembling as they had at the start. The mule answered her quiet commands. When the path narrowed and the wagon rocked, she steadied it with an elastic patience. Each small competence stitched a new piece into her sense of self. It was not a grand transformation, not a single flash of miracle. It was the slow, certain weaving of muscle and mind into something durable. The girls grew bolder with every mile. Ruth wanted to learn how to mend a tear in the canvas and asked Elias to show her stitches while Mary watched, smiling without shame. Anna sang soft rhymes she had picked up from other traveling children, little songs about rivers and horses and the bright sun. Mary listened to them and felt the old knots inside her loosen. She began to believe the notion that children could carry with them not only the burdens of their parents, but also the possibility of a different story. That evening, as the wagon settled near a narrow ridge where the view opened into a basin of shadow and light, Mary walked with Elias to a ridge and looked down on the land they had crossed. "We'll find a place," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Elias watched her, his profile softened in the evening glow. "There are places that take time to find," he said. "But where you go, you'll build your life out of what you make." Mary let the words sink in. For years she had traded her days for someone else's pride, thinking survival meant obeying without question. Now she was learning that survival could mean setting edges where none had been, teaching her daughters to stand without him, shaping a future from small, necessary acts. She thought of Samuel's last words, threats meant to claw back control, and felt them lessen in force as her own acts accumulated. A rope learned, a rabbit skinned, a wagon driven through a pass. Night came down, with a sky of sharp stars. The girls slept beside her, their breathing sure and slow. She tightened the blanket around her shoulders and felt the warmth of the fire of Elias's steady watch, of a world where the law of her life began to be written by her own hand. She had not become unscarred. She had simply decided she would not be defined by old wounds. Before sleep took her, Mary traced the outline of her daughters' faces and whispered into the dark, "We're on our way." The promise felt true. Dawn would come again, and with it the work of building a life, small piece by small piece. For the first time, the future looked like a road she could travel with her head lifted, not hidden. By the time winter thinned and the first green returned to the valley, Mary had built a small life with Elias and her daughters at the foot of the mountain. They cleared a little plot of land, planted a garden that stubbornly pushed up through rock dust, and repaired a lean-to into a place that felt in its sparse way like home. The neighbors they met among trappers and shepherds were cautious at first. Word traveled slowly across high country. Yet comfort came in steady work, shared meals, and evenings when Mary taught Ruth to read from a battered primer, while Anna hummed a tune her mother had once known. Mary's scars remained, pale maps across her cheek and wrist, but she wrapped them in memory rather than shame. She learned to look at herself in the creek not to hide, but to remember the steps that had led her here, the choice to leave, the decision to teach her daughters how to mend a wound, how to plant seed, how to speak their names without lowering their eyes. Elias never asked for ownership. His company was quiet and undemanding. He chopped wood, fixed the cart axle, took the children to the stream to fish, and left the small household decisions to Mary, as if trusting her instinct more than any claim he might make. Neighbors began to ask Mary for small favors, a patch sewn, a wound bandaged, advice on preserving meat. She found herself speaking plainly, offering practical solutions learned from harsh years, and people listened. Their respect was slow and practical. It did not erase old whispers, but it changed how the settlement measured her worth. Her daughters attended a small schoolhouse for a season when a teacher rode through, and Ruth began to write letters in blocky hand. Mary signed each one with a name she no longer hid. Elias and Mary never married in the way the neighbors expected. They kept no big feast. Their bond was quieter, shared bread, agreed hours of labor, a mutual refusal to claim the other. On one clear morning, Mary walked into the basin without her shawl for the first time in years. The breeze lifted her hair, and she did not look away. Her daughters ran ahead, voices rising with the plain joy of children learning what freedom felt like. Rumors of her courage drifted back down into the valley. Some men grumbled that she had taken advantage. Others nodded when they passed by and tipped their hats. The preacher who had once scolded her in the pew offered her a nod that held apology more than sermon. It was not justice in the legal sense. Samuel's threats dwindled into the gossip that occupies small towns. But it was a different measure, a life rebuilt, attentive and generous, an acknowledgement that strength can be born from the decision to keep living. Years later, when Ruth married a young man from a nearby ranch, Mary braided her hair with steady fingers and felt a quiet pride. The day Ruth left, Mary did not curl inward. She stood straight and brave and let her daughter go. Anna stayed to help tend the garden, content to learn the rhythms of planting and harvest. Elias watched them both often, smiling in a way that did not require words, and Mary felt grateful not because she owed anyone anything, but because life had finally permitted her the dignity of ordinary gratitude. One evening, as snow began to dust the peaks, Mary sat at the edge of the field, her hands raw from mending a coat, and let the memory of darker days pass through her like wind through grass. She did not forget. She turned memory into caution and teaching. When the girls asked about their father, she answered plainly, speaking truth without bitterness so they would know choices and the difference between endurance and living. Then, quietly, she added, "We will make our peace." If this moved you, subscribe and click suggested video.